What happens when the line between justice and cruelty blurs into non-existence? We often think of history in terms of grand battles and noble kings, but beneath that polished surface lies a darker truth. A world where punishment wasn't just about retribution, but about crafting a spectacle of pure, unimaginable agony. Today, we journey into that world to uncover the 10 most horrific punishments ever devised by the human mind. Welcome back to Life Wild West, the channel that peels back the layers of history to reveal the raw and untamed stories hidden within. If you have a fascination for the unfiltered truths of our past, do yourself a favor and hit that subscribe button now. Trust me, what we're about to explore is a rabbit hole you won't want to climb out of. Let's begin our descent, starting with the bad and slowly working our way towards the stuff of pure nightmares. Number 10. The Rat Dungeon. Imagine yourself in medieval London, a city of stark contrasts, with towering cathedrals and shadowed alleyways. In this era, the mere mention of the Tower of London could send a chill down your spine. It wasn't just a fortress, it was a symbol of absolute power and a place of immense suffering. And deep within its bowels, a particularly dreadful fate awaited the unlucky: the Rat Dungeon. This punishment was a masterpiece of psychological and physical torment, striking paralyzing fear into the hearts of even the most hardened criminals. The cell itself was a stone-cold cavity at the very base of the tower, shrouded in perpetual, suffocating darkness. Prisoners were shackled, their limbs chained to the damp walls, leaving them completely vulnerable and disoriented. But the true horror wasn't the darkness or the chains. The dungeon's genius and its cruelty was its location. It was built right alongside the River Thames, its floor positioned just below the river's waterline. This meant that with every rising tide, the river would swell, forcing the teeming population of rats from their nests along the riverbed. For the prisoner, the ordeal began not with a sight, but with a sound. A faint, almost imperceptible scratching and scurrying. It would start as a whisper, a soft patter of tiny feet on wet stone. The prisoner, blind in the pitch black, could only listen as the sound grew. Within minutes, the scurries would multiply into the hundreds, an orchestra of tiny claws echoing from all around him. These weren't docile creatures, they were hungry, displaced, and angry river rats, funneled directly into the dungeon. They would begin to explore their new territory, and the only warm thing in it was the prisoner. Small, exploratory bites would start on the ankles, the hands, anywhere they could reach. The prisoner, chained and helpless, could only kick and scream into the void. For a few hours, he might be able to shake them off, a frantic, desperate dance in the dark. But human endurance has its limits. Exhaustion would inevitably set in, a heavy, leaden sleep brought on by pure terror and physical strain. And it was in this moment of unconsciousness that the real feasting would begin. The rats, emboldened by his stillness, would swarm over his body, taking bites from his flesh, burrowing into any wound. Waking up would be a fresh wave of agony. He would discover not just a few bites, but hundreds, covering his entire body. Yet the ordeal was far from over. Depending on the severity of his crime, he could be left down there for days or even weeks. Each high tide would bring a fresh, ravenous wave of rats, a repeating cycle of torment that eroded both body and mind. Towards the end of the medieval period, this already deranged punishment evolved. It ceased to be a tool for suffering and became a form of execution. Prisoners were no longer just tormented. They were thrown into the rat dungeon and simply forgotten about, left to be consumed by the darkness and its inhabitants, a truly horrifying end to a terrifying punishment. Number 9. The Rack. We remain within the grim stone walls of the Tower of London for our next entry. While the rat dungeon was a horror of nature unleashed, the rack was a horror of cold, calculated human engineering. It was a device synonymous with agony, a torture instrument so infamous its name alone still evokes images of unbearable pain. This form of punishment wasn't designed to kill, at least not initially. Its primary purpose was to extract a confession. It was used across Europe for centuries against criminals, supposed heretics, slaves, and prisoners of war. The device itself looked deceptively simple, like a large rectangular wooden frame, almost resembling a ladder. But instead of fixed steps, it had rollers at each end, connected to a ratchet and pulley system. When a prisoner was brought to the rack, their ordeal began. They would be laid flat on the frame, their wrists and ankles bound tightly with ropes. These ropes were then looped around the rollers. Two officials, often a combination of a torturer and a legal scribe, would stand at the ends of the device. With each turn of a handle, the ratchet would click, tightening the ropes and locking them in place. The first turn would be uncomfortable, a sharp, stretching sensation. The second turn would be painful as the prisoner's joints, shoulders, hips, knees, and elbows were pulled taut. With every subsequent turn, the strain would become excruciating. The goal was to stretch the body beyond its natural limits, creating a pain so intense that the victim would say anything to make it stop. This is where the true psychological cruelty began. Often, the officials weren't looking for the actual truth. They were looking for the answer they wanted to hear. A prisoner might confess to a crime they didn't commit, name accomplices who didn't exist, or renounce beliefs they held dear, all in a desperate bid to end the torment. Sometimes this false confession worked. Other times, the torturers would deem it a lie and continue the punishment with even more vigor. Even for those who survived the rack, life was never the same. Most were left with permanently dislocated joints. Many suffered torn ligaments, snapped muscles, and nerve damage that left them paralyzed for life. The sound of their own bones popping and ligaments tearing would be a memory seared into their minds forever. One of the most tragic and well-documented cases is that of Anne Askew in 1447. A young, educated woman of only 25, Anne was a devout Protestant in an England ruled by a fiercely Catholic-leaning King Henry VIII. Her crime? Reading the Bible in English and holding private study groups with other women, a direct defiance of the established church. She was arrested and brought to the Tower of London, where she was placed on the rack. Her torturers demanded the names of her fellow Protestant women, especially those in high society. Anne refused. For hours, they turned the crank, stretching her body until, as one witness reported, her joints were pulled from their sockets. Even the lieutenant of the tower refused to continue, appalled by the cruelty. But two of the king's own counselors took over, turning the crank themselves until she was broken. Left completely paralyzed, Anne still refused to name anyone. She had to be carried to her execution on a chair. There, unable to stand, she was tied to a stake and burned alive. Her story is a chilling testament to the rack's power, not just as a tool of pain, but as an instrument of oppression used to crush dissent and enforce conformity through sheer, unadulterated terror. Number 8. Keelhauling. We now leave the land behind and venture out onto the unforgiving open sea, where justice was as swift and brutal as a sudden storm. For sailors aboard the towering wooden ships of the 16th to 19th centuries, life was a delicate balance of hard work and rigid discipline. Stealing from a shipmate or committing acts of violence could earn you a punishment known as keelhauling, a truly maritime nightmare that usually resulted in a gruesome death. The name itself gives a clue to its horror. The keel is the long central beam running along the bottom of a ship's hull from bow to stern. It's the ship's backbone, and in those days it was covered in sharp, jagged barnacles, splinters, and marine growth. Keelhauling was the act of dragging a person under the ship across this brutal surface. The process began with the guilty sailor being brought onto the deck, the entire crew forced to watch as a warning. His arms would be tied with a heavy rope. This rope was then looped all the way around the ship's hull, passing underneath the keel before being tied off to his feet. He was now caught in a massive loop, a human puppet on a string held by his fellow sailors. With a final command, he was thrown overboard. The shock of the cold ocean water would be the first assault. Then, the men on deck would begin to pull. There were two ways this could go. A quick keel-hauling meant they pulled with all their might, dragging him rapidly under the ship. This often resulted in his head being slammed against the hull, potentially knocking him unconscious or breaking his neck instantly. The slow method was far more sadistic. The sailors would pull the rope gradually, ensuring the victim was conscious for every agonizing moment. As he was dragged down, the pressure of the water would crush his lungs. He would be desperate for air, but his descent continued. Then came the keel. The barnacles acted like a giant cheese grater. As his body was dragged across the bottom of the ship, his back, legs, and arms would be sliced and shredded. The pain would be unimaginable. A combination of drowning, blunt force trauma, and thousands of deep, ragged cuts, all happening simultaneously in the dark, crushing depths. For most, death was a certainty. They would either drown, bleed out, or die from the sheer trauma of the event before they even made it to the other side. But what if, by some twisted miracle, a sailor actually survived the journey around the hull? His ordeal wasn't over. One of three things would typically happen. 1, he'd be deemed tough and they'd send him for a second round. No one survived round 2. 2, he would be hauled back on board, a bloody, broken mess. He might be forgiven, but he would almost certainly die a slow, agonizing death from the massive infections that would set into his countless wounds. 3, in the rarest of cases, he might actually live. But he would be a shadow of his former self, his body covered head to toe in a grotesque tapestry of scars, a walking reminder of the day he was dragged through hell and back. Number 7. Crushing by elephant. Now we are getting to the part of our list where survival is no longer an option. This next form of execution is a bizarre and brutal display of power, using one of nature's most intelligent and majestic creatures as a weapon. For centuries across South and Southeast Asia, but most famously in India, execution by elephant was a very real and terrifying public spectacle. The most recent uses were in the 19th century, which is disturbingly recent in the grand scheme of history. So, what kind of crime would you have to commit to be sentenced to death by elephant? You might think it was reserved for the most heinous murderers or traitors, and while it was used for them, it was also used for far lesser offenses. Failing to pay your taxes could get you a one-way ticket to being crushed. Stealing or being an enemy soldier were also common reasons. But the most disturbing case in history comes from the 4th Mughal Emperor of India, Jahangir. Legend says that one day, simply because he was bored and craved some entertainment, he ordered a massive number of criminals to be crushed to death in a single day. It became a carnival of cruelty. The man who forgot his taxes, crushed. The man who stole a piece of fruit, crushed. The orphan who jaywalked, crushed. These public executions were always a grand affair, meant to showcase the absolute power of the ruling class. Central to the spectacle was the mahout, the elephant's rider, who would sit atop the massive beast, guiding its every move with subtle commands. The message was clear. Look how powerful we are. We can command this magnificent beast to be an instrument of death. Now be impressed and be obedient. There were a few different methods this execution could take. If you were lucky, you'd face the swiftest one. The criminal would have their arms tied behind their back, and their head would be placed on a stone block or pedestal. On command, the elephant would raise its massive foot and bring it down with immense force, crushing the person's skull like a grape. It was instantaneous and brutal. It's truly horrifying to think that these events were considered entertainment. It makes you wonder what other dark secrets are buried in the pages of history. Let me know in the comments below which one of these punishments you find the most disturbing so far. I'm genuinely curious to hear your thoughts. Now back to the elephants. The second method was far more cruel. The criminal would be laid flat on the ground. The mahout would then guide the elephant to walk over the person's body. The hope was for a quick death as the elephant's weight crushed the torso. But sometimes the elephant might misstep, crushing only a leg or an arm. The beast would then have to make a slow, ponderous U-turn to try again and again and again, while the victim screamed in agony. The final and most theatrical method was reserved for special occasions, a favorite of rulers like Emperor Jahangir. Here, a highly trained elephant would be guided to slowly dismember the person, limb by limb. It would first crush the arms, then the legs, sometimes even using its tusks to gore the victim, all before dealing the final fatal blow to the head or chest. It was a slow, drawn-out performance of death, designed to be a traumatizing spectacle for everyone watching. Number 6. Impalement. Prepare yourself, because this next one is arguably one of the most gruesome and visually horrific forms of punishment on our list. Impalement has been used by various cultures throughout history, from the Assyrians to the Ottoman Empire, but it's most famously associated with Vlad the Impaler of 15th century Wallachia, the historical figure who inspired the Dracula legend. This punishment was typically reserved for the worst of the worst. Highway robbers, grave thieves, or anyone who dared to try and start a rebellion against a ruler. It was not just an execution, it was a powerful and terrifying message. The process was methodical and sickeningly precise. It would begin with the criminal being forced to lie flat on their stomach, their arms bound tightly behind them. The executioner would then make a small, precise incision with a razor to enlarge the entry point in the victim's rear. Immediately, a thick paste or ointment would be applied to the cut. This wasn't an act of mercy, it was to stop the bleeding, ensuring the victim remained conscious for as long as possible. Next came the stake. It was a long, thick wooden pole, often as wide as a man's arm, with one end sharpened to a point, though not too sharp. A point that was too sharp would pierce vital organs too quickly, leading to a swift death, which was not the goal. The stake would be heavily greased with animal fat to make the next part of the process smoother. The stake was inserted into the incision. The executioner would then use a heavy mallet, rhythmically hammering the blunt end of the stake, driving it deeper and deeper into the person's body cavity. The pole was designed to slide past the vital organs, pushing them aside rather than piercing them, maximizing the victim's suffering. This brutal process continued until the stake emerged from the victim's shoulder, chest, head, or mouth. By the time the stake broke through the skin, the person was usually long gone, dead from internal trauma and shock. The final act was to raise the stake upright and plant it in the ground, often next to a busy road or public square. The impaled body was left as a grotesque scarecrow, a silent, horrific warning to all who passed by about the price of breaking the law. But there was another, even more sadistic version. Sometimes the criminals would be impaled just deep enough to hold them in place, but not so deep that it would cause immediate death. The stakes used for this would often have a small, seated perch built onto them to prevent the victim's own weight from driving them further down the pole and hastening their end. In these cases, they would be raised up and left to die a slow, agonizing death that could take hours or even days. They would hang there, fully conscious, pleading for help from the people walking by, slowly succumbing to dehydration, exposure, and the catastrophic internal injuries. It was a death designed to be as prolonged and public as humanly possible. Number 5. Poena Coulée. Our next entry comes from the meticulous and often bizarre legal system of ancient Rome. Poena Coulée is Latin for penalty of the sack, and that's exactly what it was, but with a terrifying twist. This punishment was exclusively reserved for one of the most reviled crimes in Roman society, parricide, the act of murdering one's own parent or close family member. First appearing in the 2nd century BC, the ritual was steeped in symbolism. The convicted murderer was first beaten with rods. Then, they were led to a large, thick leather sack, but they wouldn't be going in alone. In a truly strange and horrific collection of companions, they were joined in the sack by a dog, a rooster, a live viper, and a monkey. The meaning behind each animal is debated by historians, but the effect was undeniable. Imagine being sealed inside a pitch-black, suffocating bag with 4 terrified and aggressive animals. The chaos, the scratching, the biting, the hissing, it would be a frenzy of panic and pain in complete darkness. Once all the occupants were inside, the bag was sewn shut, creating an almost airtight seal. But this horrifying ordeal was just the beginning. The final step was to take the writhing, chaotic sack and toss it into the nearest river or the ocean, where it would sink to the bottom. The victim would die from a combination of drowning, asphyxiation, and the attacks from the frantic animals trapped inside with them. The Romans believed that a person who killed their own kin was so unnatural that they shouldn't be allowed to touch the earth, breathe the air, or see the sky in their final moments. This punishment was a way of utterly erasing them from the world. Later in Roman history, as gladiatorial games became more popular, those convicted of parricide were sometimes given a choice. They could either suffer the penalty of the sack or be sent to the Colosseum to be mauled to death by wild beasts in front of a cheering crowd. It was a choice between a private, suffocating horror and a very public, brutal spectacle. Some choice. The fact that these meticulously planned punishments existed is a stark reminder of the creativity that can go into cruelty. If you're finding this dark journey through history as compelling as I am, take a second to hit the like button. It really helps the channel dig up more of these forgotten and fascinating stories. Number 4. Rats, the sequel. We've already visited the horrors of the rat dungeon, but humanity's cruel ingenuity found other, even more intimate ways to weaponize these creatures. This next punishment is one of the most psychologically sick and twisted in all of human history. I'll cover 2 variations here, as they are born from the same dark impulse. The first method dates back to the 80 Years' War in the 16th century. A Dutch leader named Diederik Sonoy was known to favor this particular brand of torture. It involved taking a large clay or metal bowl and placing a live rat inside it. The bowl was then placed, open side down, onto a prisoner's naked body, on their stomach, chest, or groin. The final element was fire. The executioner would heat the outside of the bowl with a torch or hot coals. As the bowl grew hotter and hotter, the rat inside would be driven into a full-blown panic. Its only instinct would be to escape the searing heat, and the only way out was down. The rat would begin to claw and gnaw, desperately trying to burrow its way out. It would dig into the prisoner's flesh, tearing through skin, muscle, and eventually internal organs in its frantic search for an escape route from the heat. For the prisoner, it was an unimaginable agony, feeling a creature chew its way through their insides. Eventually, the rat would find its way out. The same could not be said for the prisoner. But the second method was, in many ways, far worse for its cold, clinical cruelty. This was a highly secretive torture method used in the 20th century, under the brutal dictatorship of Augusto Pinochet in Chile. He held power from 1973 to 1990, a period marked by the disappearance and torture of thousands of political opponents. They called this technique the rectoscope. The name alone tells you everything you need to know. It's exactly what you think it is. A tube would be inserted into a prisoner's rectum. A live rat was then placed inside the tube. What the rat's natural instinct, when placed in a dark, narrow tunnel, is to move forward, to find a way out. The rat would burrow its way into the prisoner's intestines. The internal pain and terror would be beyond comprehension. And in a final act of pure sadism, the torturers would attempt to interrogate the prisoners while this was happening, expecting them to answer questions as a rat chewed through their insides. The number of people who died from this specific torture is unknown, lost in the grim statistics of a brutal regime, but it stands as a chilling example of how ancient horrors can be revived with modern cruelty. Number 3. Gibbeting. This next punishment is all about making an example of someone, even long after they are dead. Gibbeting was the practice of placing a person, dead or alive, inside a metal cage and hanging them up in a public place to rot. It was a long, drawn-out process of public display, designed as a powerful deterrent. While its last known use was in Afghanistan in the early 1900s, it was particularly popular in England. After the Murder Act of 1752 was passed in England, it was required that all convicted murderers be either publicly dissected for medical science or gibbeted. Over 134 people are confirmed to have met this fate. The gibbet itself was typically an iron cage, custom-made by a blacksmith to tightly fit the shape of the human body. It was so snug that it offered no room for movement. Once locked inside, the person was hoisted 30 feet or more into the air, usually on a main road, near a town's water source, or at a harbor entrance to ensure the maximum number of people would witness the monstrosity. Imagine being a sailor approaching Boston, Massachusetts in the 18th century and seeing the caged, rotting remains of pirates swinging in the harbor breeze. It was a very clear message: don't even think about it. If the person was placed in the cage alive, their death would be a slow and agonizing one from dehydration and exposure. Every time locals came to the town well for water, they'd have to listen to the dying man's pleas for a single sip, a constant grim reminder of his fate. But the public's torment didn't end with the criminal's death. The body was left inside the cage to decompose for years, or even decades. The stench of rotting flesh would hang over the town, a putrid cloud that locals complained was so pungent they couldn't sleep at night. There are even official reports of human remains being left inside these cages for over 20 years before a government official finally remembered to have them cleaned out. It was a punishment that continued to punish the community long after the criminal was gone. The fact that human beings were capable of designing and carrying out such prolonged acts of cruelty is truly mind-boggling. If this video is making you think about the hidden corners of our history, consider sharing it with a friend who appreciates these deeper, darker stories. Number 2. Scaphism. We travel now to the ancient Persian Empire for what might be the most disgusting, drawn-out, and biologically horrifying punishment ever conceived. It was known as Scaphism, or more colloquially, the boats. This fate was reserved for those convicted of the most serious crimes, like murder and treason. The process began with the criminal being taken to a lake or a stagnant swamp. They were placed inside a narrow, hollowed-out log or a small rowboat and tied down securely on their backs. Sometimes, a second boat was placed on top of them, creating a sort of coffin with holes cut out for their head, arms, and legs to protrude. Then came the force feeding. The executioners would pour a mixture of milk and honey down the victim's throat, forcing them to consume large quantities until their stomach was visibly bloated and distended. After this, they would lather the victim's entire body, especially their face, arms, and legs, with more of the same sweet, sticky mixture. Finally, they were pushed out into the middle of the lake and left to drift, completely exposed to the relentless heat of the sun. But the sun would soon be the least of their worries. The milk and honey mixture was designed for a specific gruesome purpose: to induce extreme, uncontrollable diarrhea. The combination of the filth inside the boat and the sweet honey slathered on their exposed skin created an irresistible beacon for every insect and vermin in the area. Flies, wasps, bees, and swarms of other biting bugs would descend upon them, attracted by the sweetness and the filth. They would lay eggs in the person's flesh, and their larvae would begin to hatch and burrow. But the torture was designed to be prolonged. Every single day, a boat would row out to the victim, not to rescue them, but to force-feed them another large meal of milk and honey. This daily ritual ensured they wouldn't die quickly from dehydration or starvation. It kept them alive to suffer. Rodents and water creatures, attracted by the stench, would begin to nibble on their submerged limbs. The historian Plutarch wrote that the victim's flesh would literally be eaten away as parasites and worms swarmed in their own filth inside the boat. One man was recorded to have survived for a staggering 17 days before he finally died from a combination of dehydration, septic shock, and gangrenous infection. It was a death by 1,000 bites, a slow decay while fully conscious. Number 1. The Oubliette. We have arrived at the end of our journey at a punishment whose name is derived from the French word oubliette, which simply means to forget. The oubliette was the ultimate expression of despair, a form of imprisonment designed to make a person vanish from the world, to be utterly and completely forgotten by the living. These were found in castles and dungeons across medieval Europe. Sometimes they were just incredibly small rooms like the one in the Tower of London nicknamed Little Ease. This cell was so small that a prisoner could not stand up, sit down, or lie down comfortably. They were forced into a perpetual painful crouch, left in pitch darkness for days on end. But the true oubliette was something far worse. Deep underground in a castle's dungeons, you would find a very narrow bottle-shaped cell made entirely of stone, with a small trapdoor at the very top as its only entrance. Prisoners were simply dropped into the hole. The heavy door was shut and they were forgotten. Death would usually come within a few days from dehydration or starvation. That was the best-case scenario. More often than not, the new prisoner would not be alone. They would be dropped in on top of the rotting corpse of the cell's previous occupant, a constant grim reminder of their own impending fate in the suffocating darkness. And of course, being deep underground, these dungeons were infested with rats who had long since developed a taste for human flesh. The prisoner would have to endure the final days of their life, listening to the scurrying and feeling the bites of the creatures that would soon make a meal of them. In recent times, as these old castles have been renovated, archaeologists have made horrifying discoveries. In Leap Castle in Ireland, during renovations in the early 1900s, workers found a hidden oubliette. Inside, it was filled with so many human skeletons that it took multiple cartloads to clear them all out, proof that these cells were almost never cleaned. But the most psychologically devastating version of the oubliette was when the captors chose to keep the prisoner alive. They would be kept for years or even decades, surviving on scraps of food and sips of water lowered down from above. Sometimes, these cells were even located where the prisoner could just barely hear the sounds of life from the castle above. Laughter, music, conversation. A constant, torturous reminder of the world they had lost forever as they slowly wasted away, forgotten by everyone. From the depths of the rat-infested dungeon to the final, silent horror of the oubliette, we've seen the terrifying extent of human cruelty. These weren't just punishments, they were statements, designed to inflict maximum pain and to terrorize entire populations into submission. Thank you for joining us on this dark expedition into the past here on Life Wild West. To make sure you never miss another exploration into the wild, untamed history of our world, do us a huge favor and hit that subscribe button, and be sure to ring the notification bell so you're the first to know when we uncover our next story. Until next time, stay curious.